the 8th of May 1945. In Munich, Germany, the war was over, and American and German officers were meeting to finalize surrender terms. The room was tense, with armed guards on both sides. But one German general, General Major Kurt von Gottberg, refused to accept defeat gracefully. He stood across from Patton's staff, tall, aristocratic, his Wehrmacht uniform still perfect. He had commanded panzers on the Eastern Front, survived Stalingrad, and his hand rested near his sidearm. When Patton entered, von Gottberg did not stand or salute. Patton's aide delivered the final terms. Von Gottberg listened, then spoke in perfect English, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You Americans fought a safe war, arrived late, and never faced what we faced in Russia. Calling yourself a warrior is an insult to those of us who actually bled for it." The American guards raised their rifles. Patton raised his hand. "Stop." And he smiled because George Patton had been waiting his entire life. This is the story of what Patton said to the German general who called him a coward before we get into this story. If you want more untold moments from World War II, hit that subscribe button. New videos every week. To understand what happened in that room, you need to understand who these two men were and why this moment was inevitable. May 1945, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich was finished, but the logistics of surrender were complicated. Millions of German soldiers needed to be processed, equipment needed to be catalogued, and commanders needed to formally hand over their units. The Americans set up processing centers across occupied Germany, one of which was in a requisitioned state outside Munich. Senior Wehrmacht officers would arrive, sign documents, surrender their weapons, and be transported to prisoner of war camps. It was supposed to be orderly, professional, a formality, but not every German officer accepted defeat the same way. General Major Kurt von Gottberg was 48 years old. He was a Prussian aristocrat and a career military man. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1935 and risen through the ranks, commanding panzer units by 1943. He was on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets. He had seen hell, the frozen retreat from Moscow, the meat grinder of Kursk, and the nightmare of Stalingrad. He had been one of the few senior officers to escape the encirclement. Von Gottberg believed in something, not necessarily in Hitler or the Nazi Party, but in the idea that the German military was superior. He believed that German officers were the finest warriors in the world. He believed that the Wehrmacht had only lost because of overwhelming numbers, not because they had been outfought. He absolutely believed that the Americans had not earned their victory. To von Gottberg, the Americans were tourists who had arrived late to the war. They faced a German army already broken by years of fighting the Soviets. They had advanced across France against token resistance. They had never experienced the brutal. In the desperate combat of the Eastern Front, he viewed Patton with particular contempt. Patton was famous, celebrated in American newspapers, and called a great general. But von Gottberg saw him as a showman, a man with good equipment and endless supplies who had never faced a real test. Von Gottberg arrived at the Munich processing center on May 8th. He was told he would be surrendering his command to representatives of General Patton's Third Army. He decided he would not make it easy. George Patton was in Munich that week overseeing the occupation. Germany had surrendered 2 days earlier, and the formal ceremonies were done. But Patton wanted to personally ensure the process was going smoothly. He was at Third Army headquarters when he received word that a German general at the processing center was being difficult. The German general was refusing to cooperate and making inflammatory statements. Patton's staff suggested they handle it, send MPs, and arrest him if necessary. Patton had a different idea. He would go himself. He arrived at the estate in his jeep, full dress uniform, 3 stars, and gleaming ivory-handled revolvers on his belt. He walked into the processing room where von Gottberg was waiting. The room was set up simply. A large table, American officers on one side, German officers on the other. Armed guards from both sides were lining the walls. The surrender documents were on the table, waiting to be signed. Von Gottberg stood on the German side, ramrod straight, his Wehrmacht uniform immaculate. Despite weeks of retreat and chaos, his Iron Cross was prominently displayed, and he looked every inch the Prussian officer. When Patton entered, every American in the room stood at attention. Von Gottberg did not move. It was a calculated insult because in military culture you stand when a superior officer enters. Von Gottberg was making a statement. He did not recognize Patton's authority. He did not respect him. And Patton noticed. He said nothing. He walked to the American side of the table and sat down. And Patton's aide, a major, stood and read the terms. Standard surrender protocol. Von Gottberg would sign the documents, surrender his sidearm, and be transported to a POW facility. For processing, von Gottberg listened without expression. When the major finished, there was silence. Then von Gottberg spoke. His English was perfect. Aristocratic accent, controlled tone, but the words were designed to wound General Patton. He began, "I have heard much about you. The newspapers call you a great warrior, a brilliant commander, the hero of the American army." He paused and said, "I find this amusing." The room tensed, and he said, "You Americans arrived in Europe in 1944. By then we had been fighting for 5 years. We had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and Africa. We had faced enemies who wanted to destroy us completely, and we fought when we were outnumbered. We fought when we had no fuel, and when we had no air support, when our cities were burning and our families were starving." Von Gottberg's voice grew harder. "You fought a wealthy man's war. You had unlimited supplies. You had air superiority. You never went hungry. You never fought an enemy that truly wanted to annihilate you. You advanced across France against an army that was already defeated by the Soviets, and you call this heroism?" He looked directly at Patton. "You say you are a warrior, but you have never faced what we faced in Russia. You have never experienced real war. Calling yourself a great general is an insult to those of us who actually bled for it. You are not a warrior. You are a tourist who arrived when the hard work was already done." The American guards moved. Rifles came up, fingers on triggers. Patton raised his hand. "Stop." The room froze, and Patton stood slowly. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of von Gottberg. He was close enough to see the Iron Cross on the German's chest, close enough to see the lines on his face. Patton's voice was quiet, but it carried. "General von Gottberg, I want to thank you. You just gave me the opportunity to say something I've been thinking for a very long time." Von Gottberg's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. Patton continued, "You're right about one thing. The Eastern Front was brutal, and your army fought hard there. I don't question that. But here's what you don't understand. Fighting hard and fighting well are not the same thing. You say you faced superior numbers. You did. Do you know why? Because your Führer started a war he couldn't win. Because your generals followed orders that made no strategic sense, and because you confused brutality with brilliance, you survived Stalingrad. Congratulations. Do you know what that tells me? That you were part of an army that was stupid enough to get trapped there in the first place. A competent army doesn't march into a city they can't hold, and a competent general doesn't sacrifice hundreds of thousands of men. For pride." Von Gottberg's jaw tightened. Patton stepped closer. "You say I fought a wealthy man's war. You're right, I did. Do you know what that means? It means I understood that war is won with logistics, supply lines, industrial capacity, and planning. You fought with desperation and ideology. I fought with math. I won. You lost, and you are standing here trying to convince yourself that losing hard somehow makes you noble. And you call me a tourist. Let me tell you something about tourists, General. Tourists know when to leave. You and your army didn't. You stayed in Russia until it destroyed you. You stayed in France until we destroyed you. You stayed in this war until your country was rubble and your families were starving. That's not courage, that's stupidity. The room was absolutely silent. Patton's voice dropped even lower. You want to know the difference between you and me? I fought to win. You fought to prove something. I protected my men. You sacrificed yours. I ended this war. You prolonged it. And here's the part that really bothers you. You know I'm right. You can stand there in your perfect uniform, with your medals and your pride. But we both know that when this war is written about, nobody is going to remember you. They're going to remember the Americans who ended it. And they're going to remember me. You say I'm not a warrior, but I'm the one standing in your country. You're the one about to be processed like cattle and sent to a camp, so tell me, General, who won? Von Gottberg said nothing. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from rage or something else. It was impossible to tell. Patton turned and walked back to his side of the table. Sign the documents, he said. Without looking back, or don't. I don't care. But if you refuse, I will have you dragged out of here and thrown in a cell with the common soldiers. You think you're better than? The choice is yours. For a long moment, von Gottberg didn't move. Then slowly he walked to the table. He picked up the pen, his hand was steady now, and signed his name. He removed his Luger from its holster and placed it on the table. He unbuckled his belt and laid it down. He stood at attention and said, I am ready for transport, quietly, and Patton nodded to the MPs. They escorted von Gottberg out of the room. When the German was gone, Patton's aide approached. Sir? That was. Patton cut him off. That was a man who needed to hear the truth. I'm tired of these people acting like losing heroically makes them superior to winning decisively. He picked up von Gottberg's Luger, examined it. Quality German engineering. Handed it to his aide. Send this to the museum at West Point. With a note. This belonged to a German general who confused suffering with strength. Let the cadets learn the difference. General Major Kurt von Gottberg spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp before being released in 1947. He returned to Germany and lived quietly until his death in 1963. He never spoke publicly about his encounter with Patton, but according to people who knew him, he also never again claimed that the Wehrmacht had been superior to the American army. The story of what Patton said spread through Third Army. Within days it became legendary among the officers. A perfect example of Patton's philosophy. Win decisively, protect your men, and don't confuse brutality with competence. Patton wrote about the encounter briefly in a letter to his wife. Met a German general today who thought losing made him noble, and I explained that it just made him a loser. He didn't take it well. The exchange at Munich represents something important about how Patton saw war. He had no patience for the romanticism of suffering and didn't believe that fighting harder made you better. He believed in results, in winning, in getting your soldiers home alive. Von Gottberg represented an old European military tradition, one where honor and sacrifice were considered more important than victory, and where dying for a cause was seen as glorious. Patton represented something different. American pragmatism. Win the war. Save your men. Go home. No romance. No theatrics. Just results. The German general thought Patton was a coward because he hadn't suffered enough. Patton thought the German was a fool because he had suffered unnecessarily, and history proved Patton right. If you were in Patton's position, facing a defeated enemy who refused to acknowledge your victory, how would you respond? Would you ignore the insult or confront it directly? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to hear about the time Patton defied direct orders to rescue American prisoners behind enemy lines, hit subscribe so you don't miss it.